And so it's my pleasure to introduce Karen Finney, who is an MSNBC political analyst and strategist. She is all over the place. It was been great to see her on MSNBC more with some voice of reason as well as facts and statistics. So please, a round of applause to Karen Finney.
Can you guys hear me? Is this on? Yeah? Thank you very much. Thanks, Joe. It's good to see you. I apologize for being late. I will start by saying there's some great news for progressives in that Nancy Pelosi will be staying. So that's really awesome news. Yeah. So kind of where I'm going to go is kind of to pick up on actually some of what these guys have been talking about in terms of the data and the numbers in the political context and sort of what does that mean going forward in terms of the policy conversations and the political conversation. And I think some of what I'm going to say, you'll hear also from Cornell, and because a lot of his data I think supports these points as well. Just to start, I mean, as you heard, I mean, think about this Obama coalition of voters is blacker and browner and younger and more unmarried women. Although the media hasn't focused on it as much, the president did also have a healthy share of white working class voters and white voters. So to me, the most important message out of that is that I think what the president showed is that now 2 election cycles, you cannot win a national election in this country without a broad coalition of voters. And I think that's a very important moment because the Republicans really, I think, doubled down on a strategy that suggested between voter suppression efforts and a focus on white voters and simply saying we're not going to worry about Latinos and African Americans and everybody else. That just simply doesn't work. And I think it's part of why you're seeing this sort of chaos in the Republican Party right now. But I think it also creates a real political opportunity more broadly. Just a couple things. The other thing that I think we need to look at is, I sort of marvel at how now the buzzword is demographics, right? Because it's like it was some secret that, and as some have said, like, it's called the census. I mean, and there are a lot of us who've been saying for a long time, we are going to be a minority-majority country. It's happening. You can hide under the covers and pretend it's not, but guess what? It's here. And I think in addition to the demographic data, the issue landscape, I think, also is really shifting. I think that's part of what we saw in this election. Personhood amendments have been failing all over the country. Maryland passed their own version of a DREAM Act. Marijuana is now legal in a couple of states, and marriage equality. And overall, if you think about the fact that this election, the center argument on the economy, with this idea of a balanced approach and sort of the role of government, the president won that argument. And I think as progressives or as people trying to push a progressive agenda, we should not shrink from that. I mean, we won that argument, fair and square. They had, and it's not, to me, it's also not just that in this election they made their argument. They've been trying to bash this argument for 2 years and spent millions and millions of dollars, and they still lost. And communities of color are a big part of why they lost, and so I think there's a heritage there that we need to embrace. But again, I think we need to also acknowledge that as much as the demographics have changed, the issue landscape has changed. And if you look at millennial voters, the millennial generation, they are also more multicultural, they are more independent-minded, they, in terms of marriage equality, they are sort of the opinion, I'm not going to tell you who to marry if you don't tell me who to marry. They are very issue-oriented and have a real sense of social justice, sort of lower religiosity. But the point being, these trends are only going to continue, right? This is not like this was the phenomenon of 2012, and by the time we hit 2016, it'll be something else. The millennial generation of voters are inheriting, and they're much more progressive than I think most conservatives would like to admit. So the point being, we're going to be a progressive or center-left country, I think, for quite a fair amount of time to come, because I don't think the Republicans are going to figure out how to talk to and really make good on the issues that we care about. And I think within that landscape, that creates an opportunity for both for people of color, because the Republican Party is now trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we deal with this? And a lot of what you're hearing is, Sean Hannity, I'm evolving on immigration reform, and this. Although some are saying, well, it's those people, they just want free stuff. That's why they voted for the president. I think that's probably not going to be a winning strategy for them. Just saying, didn't work for Mitt Romney with the whole 47% thing, but So, and I say that to say that I think part of what you're going to see on the conservative side is they may be able to put a little spit and polish on it and for the midterm elections in some of these gerrymandered districts. But again, the broader political power, at the national level, they know they have to change. And I think what they're looking at, and when I've talked to a couple of Republican pollsters, they acknowledge it's a 2 presidential cycle problem that they have. They're not going to fix it by 2016. They're going to throw Marco Rubio out there. They're going to, Jeb Bush. I mean, they're going to try. I think they're underestimating how deep their problem is. Because again, I think that the issues that we're talking about are not just how do we placate people of color to win an election. I think, since we fundamentally have a disagreement in the argument that we're making, and also the role of government. I think one of the things they don't recognize is that for a lot of more Americans, I would say, our experience of the role of government in our lives is very different than the 1% of Americans in a myriad of ways. And I think the campaign tried to show this in their sort of Life of Julia in terms of everything from college loans to mortgage assistance, I mean, you name it. So I think just the fundamental relationship we have to how we think about the role of government is different for more people. So again, their arguments just aren't washing. On the other side, though, and this is where I think we have the most leverage, Democrats know it too. Because the truth is, Barack Obama is not going to be on the top of the ticket in 2016. So, and yes, a lot of people were motivated to come out and vote. As you guys were talking about, I think, the voter suppression efforts had the exact opposite effect. And one of the things I hope Cornell will share with you, he had data about 8 months ago that showed sort of every time, Donald Trump opened his mouth with the birther stuff, or, we had that, actually our enthusiasm on our side went up, not just among African Americans, but among Latinos and among moderates as well, who just didn't like that kind of talk. So Democrats know that they need this broad coalition of voters too. And that's, to me, where the real power is, the real political power is, and where the real leverage is, particularly if communities of color, if we stick together. And one of the things I thought was interesting in some of the exit poll data, 80% of African Americans said they support the DREAM Act. So, we actually, and I would, if you look at what was happening around some of the immigration legislation in Alabama and Arizona, I mean, when you talk about racial profiling, Latinos have, we can stand with Latinos and say, yeah, we get that. And so I think there's an opportunity, and particularly some of the economic issues that we're talking about and how the recession, hit communities of color and the kinds of changes that we need to see in the budget and the kinds of concerns that we have about the way we proceed when we talk about entitlement reforms and some of these other economic issues. I think if, the real opportunity is if we stick together, both political parties know they need this coalition of voters going forward. And I would just add to that with women, women pretty much delivered for the president. We also increased our share of the electorate. I'm sure Margie probably talked about that. And as minorities, we increased our share of the total electorate by 2%, despite, I would tell you, the fact that the mantra was, that's not going to happen. That was just 2008. It's going to be lower turnout, despite the fact that, all the data shows that actually the electorate is always expanding. It's not contracting. So again, I think both political parties are in a moment where they recognize they need us. And to me, that opens up a real opportunity. I think on the Republican side, there are some who genuinely get it that they don't understand. When they talk about an opportunity society in some of the ways that they talk about these things, it's just not connecting, which I think opens up an important opportunity to try to build some bridges to moderates who might not think of themselves as people who would support a progressive agenda, but who can potentially be brought along in this moment where some in their party are sort of self-reflecting. I say during the campaign, I would sort of talk to people about when you talk about free stuff and welfare, do you guys get what you're activating in people? Do you get that those are very old, ugly stereotypes? Some people did. Newt Gingrich, I'm pretty sure, does. But a lot of people, I'll be honest with you, didn't. They don't have that experience. And so, there was an opportunity, I think, to have that conversation. And I think that's part of in terms of broadening political power and bringing more people kind of into the circle in terms of the issues that we're trying to advocate for. I really do think there's an opportunity. I think part of the opportunity, though, is, I think there's the political opportunity, which I'll talk about in a minute, but then also the messaging opportunity. I think we have to be really smart about how we communicate and message, because so often just the label or the word stops people in their tracks from even being willing to listen. The example I give a lot is when you say pro-choice versus pro-life, right? People have very specific ideas about what that means. But then if you talk to people individually, they might say, well, I don't think I should be telling somebody else what to do, but that wouldn't be right for me. Well, I would consider that person pro-choice. They don't consider themselves pro-choice necessarily. So I think in some of these issues, we need to be thinking about language. And the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did some really interesting work sort of looking at how Democrats and Republicans think about disparities. And this was specifically targeting health disparities, but I think there's some interesting insights for economic disparity as well. Just because their general sort of finding was that whereas Democrats sort of view the world and think about these things as, it's all part of a well-functioning system, and if one part, and it's all inclusive, and if one part is out of whack, that affects everybody's out of whack. So so when we talk about we need to lift people up, on the Democratic side, most people are thinking, okay, some are here and we're just gonna do this. On the Republican side, they tend to think of things in a more what they would consider a linear journey, right? Like everybody makes their own choices. Of course, not everybody starts out the same place. Not everybody's going to end the same place. So if you got some people here, it's not realistic that people here are ever going to be up here necessarily. That's not even necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about just lifting people up. But what they hear a lot of times is, well, I'm going to take something away to be able to, that we have to go this way instead of this way. And so I think, one of the really important tasks ahead is how do we break through some of the language so that we're not immediately having people put up barriers. And some of that is talking about, when you talk to people about, particularly in terms of economic disparities, not everybody has the opportunity to make good decisions because they're just not those kinds of choices. Not everybody has those opportunities for those kinds of choices. So how do we make sure more choices are available? Republicans are always talking about more choices. So, how do we co-opt some of their language to get them on our side on some of the, the issues that we care about, particularly as we enter into, and I'll switch to the political piece, this moment where, we've got the fiscal cliff, the budget, I think immigration reform, those are the big, tax reform. The president probably has about 18 months to get done whatever he's going to get done. So this is going to be, I think, a very intense period. And what I would say is, I think within this framework, it's important to both hold elected leaders accountable for the things that we care about. And when we look at the conversation that's going on, I do think the fact that Pelosi is going to be with us, in a leadership role for Democrats in the House is tremendously important. I think she's an unsung hero. We were just talking about this, of the Affordable Care Act, and there's a lot that got done that would not have gotten done without her. And I think she will be somebody who will provide a really important balance on a progressive agenda. But I think we need to remember a couple things as we enter into this conversation. Some of the recent polling, this is post-election polling, showed, 60% of Americans are actually okay if we have to increase taxes, particularly if we have to increase taxes on the wealthy. So despite the rhetoric from the Republicans, because they need to not upset Grover Norquist, they're negotiating with themselves a little bit here because, we've already got the majority of Americans on our side, which is a different kind of conversation that we can have about what needs to happen. The Pew also found that 53% of Americans say that the GOP would be to blame if we fall off the cliff. And that 29% said they would blame Obama and about 10% said they would blame Bush. I say that to say I think the president enters this conversation in a very different place than we were the last time. more Americans are sort of where I think we are in terms of the concerns we had, for example, about the Ryan budget and the impact of those kinds of cuts in terms of the economic disparities we're talking about. So I think in terms of political power, the opportunity is holding members of Congress accountable in this conversation, but also holding the president accountable and trying to create that sort of political space for him to negotiate in the ways that we want him to negotiate. I think you're going to see, obviously, a lot of groups are going to be very firm about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, particularly on entitlement reforms, and I think keeping that pressure on. And I think also we have to maintain and sort of take a new attitude, in this moment, and I see Cornell in the back, and I think he'll agree with me on this, that this is America. This is not a nice to do. We're not asking for favors anymore. The political reality in this country is you cannot win a national election without this broad coalition of voters, period. And we need to act like that, and we need to come to the table like that in these conversations because they know it, and so we need to act like we know that they know it, and we know it as well. And I think that's the real opportunity.